It's Monday, May 4th, and we're continuing our series post World War II. We've now entered into the Cold War. All right, just a reminder on May 6th, which is Wednesday, the Quiz 22 is due. Open book, open notes, open video, use what you need to do. No plagiarism. Do not be copying word for word. You should be able to take these ideas and put them into your own words. Do not work together at any part. Do this entirely on your own. At least 100 words, and the question is, what made America such a powerful combatant in World War II? You could tell me the military perspective, you could tell me the economic perspective, you could tell me the strategic, tactical, whatever you want to do to answer that question, that's fine, but I'd like you to think about that and then give me an answer. All right, let's continue where we left off. Yesterday we introduced the Marshall Plan. The last time we were together, we introduced the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was America's attempt to rebuild Europe in light of the destruction of World War II. There had been it would have happened eventually. The Europeans were already at work. There is a lot of debate as to how effective it was. I personally think it was extremely effective, as the Americans pumped in today's money, almost $120 billion into the economies of Europe. And it came with strings, very good strings that required deregulation in some places, increased efficiency in others. Not only did America send money and goods and supplies, it also sent best business practices and better guidance as to how to rebuild. Now, as I mentioned, the Marshall Plan stood in stark contrast to the Soviet treatment, the Molotov Plan. The Soviets took control and, well, honestly, spoiled the nations that they now oversaw. Now, this division in approach led to inevitable confrontation, which came in June of 1948. Really, the first major clash of the Cold War is June of 1948. The city of Berlin was unique. When the Allies had partitioned Germany after World War II, so Germany was divided into two, East Germany and West Germany. But there was one exception. The city of Berlin was deep inside of East German territory. But Berlin had also been divided into East Berlin and West Berlin. So the city of Berlin, deep in Soviet territory, and yet it was still a small outpost of freedom, of Western values. The Soviets decided to blockade the West on the ground, meaning no trucks, no trains, no supplies were going to come in. So to give you an idea of what this looked like, here is the partition, East Germany, West Germany, but what had happened is there were arrangements that had been made that allowed for roads and for trains to go back and forth between West Germany and West Berlin. The Soviets eliminated this. Done. And when they did so, basically West Berlin was on the clock for starvation. That was the general thought. The blockade was a response to the population escaping East Berlin to freedom and to challenge the Americans. The Soviets discovered right away there was a problem as they blockaded, or excuse me, as the two nations and the two philosophies progressed apart. The people in East Germany wanted to be in West Germany. There was freedom, there was prosperity, there was hope. And so many people were pouring out of East Berlin into West Berlin. And once they were in West Berlin, they could make their way to West Germany in freedom. So the Soviets felt that they needed to stop this. The Americans responded to this blockade. So now you have West Berlin. You have a people, hundreds of thousands of people. You have a city, excuse me, hundreds of thousands of people with no visible means of being resupplied. Food and other material goods. The Americans responded with the largest air shipping operation in history. It was called the Berlin Airlift. Berlin was kept alive by air cargo delivery. In fact, during the midst of all this, some American pilots, began actually dropping small parachutes of candy. This brought the Allies tremendous goodwill from Germany itself and helped to rebuild so many of the shattered relationships after World War II. So this is the Berlin airport. These are they were called C-47s in military parlance, but they were known as the DC-3, one of the most common of all transport aircraft that's ever been built. You could see as this circle is that they would just line up, and as they pulled up, sometimes engines still running, they would be unloaded and off they would go for another round of deliveries. And by doing this, it was a spectacular bit of logistics. Berlin was fed and supplied. I want to point out this right here. See this in the air? This is small drops of candy that are tied to small handkerchiefs that are acting as parachutes. Children would wait down here. It began with children would wait at the end of the runway just to watch the airplanes come in. One of the American pilots, a former World War II pilot, realized this was happening, and he decided to throw out a little bit of candy. And as he did so, he could see the children got it, and one thing led to another, and pretty soon many of the pilots were doing this. And so children would stand there and they would receive chocolates and other forms of candy, and Berlin was supplied. Eventually, the Berlin airlift was so successful, the Soviets ended the blockade because it was pointless. Berlin was receiving just as many supplies as they were before the blockade had been instituted. But it did make it made obvious what everyone suspected, namely that there was deep division and that this was going to be an unspoken war. So in 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed, and it formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or its abbreviation, NATO. NATO became the military grouping of the United States and its West European allies. So this was a new thing because it clearly bound the United States to Europe. No more would America retreat in isolationism. In response, the Soviets formed the Warsaw Pact. Now, the difference is NATO was a purely voluntary treaty, and a number of West European nations chose to not be part of NATO. Warsaw Pact was an absolute imposed treaty in which nations like Poland and Romania and Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were forced into an alliance with the Soviet Union. Now, admittedly, some of them did so more readily than others. Yugoslavia under Joseph Tito is kind of its own story. The world was now divided. There was the First World, the Second World, and the Third World. And most people have heard the phrase Third World. It did not come about as most people expect. Most people think Third World means poor. Actually, Third World means unaligned. First World meant nations that were connected to NATO. Second World meant nations that were connected to the Warsaw Pact. And Third World meant nations that were connected to neither. And it just so happened that many of the Third World nations tended to be poor, and neither side really cared whether or not they were with them. In 1949, the Soviets detonated their first nuclear weapon. We mentioned that last time. The Soviets had been working on the atomic bomb all the way back in 1942. Many nations had, but they had made very little progress. Hiroshima and Nagasaki changed everything. Stalin now realized the power of the atomic bomb, and so he gave strict instruction as to how diligently they were to pursue it. Spying was their most promising hope. The Soviets were going to have a lot more progress if they stole the secret rather than developed themselves. Unfortunately, there were many American and British communist traitors that helped them. Those traitors doomed millions to suffer in slavery. The Soviets had even had more, let's just say the Soviets have been delayed by another 3 years of developing the atomic bomb. It would have given more freedom and more ability of the Americans and the Europeans to stretch their influence, possibly provide more freedom for many of these people behind the Iron Curtain. This led to a nuclear arms race wherein each side tried to build bigger and more deadly weapons. You'll remember the last time we talked about an arms race, before World War I, in which Germany and England engaged in an arms race concerning naval warfare, each side trying to build bigger and more powerful battleships. Well, this time the Soviets and the Americans engaged in an arms race where each side tries building bigger and bigger bombs. The cost was enormous, both in money and in lives. Two of those traitors, these are Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They were instrumental in getting several nuclear secrets that have been developed sometimes during the Manhattan Project and sometimes after the Manhattan Project. But regardless, important nuclear secrets were passed by Julius and Ethel Rosenberg to the Soviet Union. They were later electrocuted for their crimes, and rightfully so. For some 50 years after their deaths, many American, especially liberals, claimed they were innocent and that it was evil that they were executed. Then when the Soviet Union fell and we went into the archives, we found out, yes, they were both spies, they were both traitors, and they absolutely deserved to die for their great evil. These two made the world a much more wicked place, and they deserve the punishment that they received. Communism was the aggressor, not only in Eastern Europe, it was actually pushing out all over the world. Stalin and the Soviets set their sights on the world. Several of these areas of conflict turned into limited, what was called proxy wars. A proxy war is when two smaller combatants fight, as representative of larger combatants. And we're going to see a couple of these proxy wars because they become fairly significant. Though individual wars, they were part of the greater Cold War conflict. So at the end of World War II, China was still unsettled. We're going to turn our attention to the Cold War as it demonstrates itself in various theaters around the world. So China was still unsettled as World War II ended. During World War II, the two main forces within China were the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek and the communists led by Mao Zedong. And there had been an agreement that had been made that neither side would fight each other so long as the Japanese were in China, and they would work together. Now, in practicality, what had happened is the communists had largely hidden and let the nationalists do the fighting against the Japanese, and because that, the Japanese had inflicted some pretty serious losses on the nationalists. But the communists had done their best to convince the people that they were the ones doing the fighting. So Japan had been expelled. Chiang Kai-shek led his forces, often at great expense, to defeat the Japanese. We talked about the truce. Mao claimed to have fought the Japanese, but actually he spent the majority of the war preparing for the war he was going to launch when the Japanese were gone. So even today, the Chinese communists claim that they were the ones who delivered China from the Japanese, and that's just not true. It's not accurate. Just as an aside, this is just a general rule of thumb that helps you. Almost everything is spoken by the Chinese government is a lie, and it's probably better if you just know that now. This is a picture of General Chiang Kai-shek over here and General Mao Zedong. This is in earlier times when things were more pleasant. From 1945 to 1949, the Chinese engaged in a civil war. Now, when I say Chiang Kai-shek is the leader of the nationalists, I am by no means saying that he is a good or a great man. He was a poor leader and a poor battlefield commander. But Mao Zedong was also a poor leader and a poor battlefield commander. You had two rather incompetent leaders going at it, but someone had to win. Most of Chiang's allies were weak and undependable. The only ally that he had that might be helpful was the United States, but the Americans, in looking at Chiang Kai-shek, thought two things. Number one, China wasn't worth the effort, and number two, Chiang Kai-shek wasn't worth the investment. And so because of that, Mao Zedong eventually won the war. This forced Chiang Kai-shek and his followers, the Chinese nationalists, to leave mainland China, and they set up on the island of Formosa, or as we know it, Taiwan. When they arrived, they immediately crushed and enslaved the local people and set up a new nation. Mao took over China, which made Asia now a communist hotspot. And eventually, this communist push spread into Korea, and we will continue that in the days ahead.